Hola. ¿Cómo está? It's good to hear you're still there, because I can't see you, so I don't know if you're going to sneak out for a cup of coffee at any point when I'm speaking. So I will be talking about the UK context and how we introduced changes to the legislation and regulation relating to how we plan and build buildings, and how we ensure that those are designed to be as accessible and inclusive for everyone. And about the process, really, through which we achieved that, which was largely by working with consensus to change the attitudes of government and building professionals. But before I start, I'd like to ask you a question. Hopefully Cristobal or somebody is ready with a microphone. But I'd just like you to take a few minutes to think about two things. One, what is your ambition? Or what ambitions do you have? And two, what do you like to do in your spare time? And we'll just spend 1 or 2 minutes thinking about that, and then I will ask you to put up your hand and share with all of us your answers to that question. Okay. So, what is your ambition, and what do you like to do in your spare time? Would somebody like to share their answers to that question? Let's have a few answers.
Mi ambición en este momento sería que la ONG que hemos creado no hace más de un mes, desde un año, tuviese éxito en la postulación que hacemos a tratar de hacer importación de elementos técnicos, pues debido a las tareas gubernamentales, la organización acá, o el gobierno que se llama Seminario, debe comprar los artículos, los elementos técnicos, a través de propuestas donde estén inscritos solo cierto comercio y las venden extremadamente caras. Y nosotros, al ser una organización sin fines de lucro, esperamos importar, vender los artículos a precio justo para poder hacer bajar el mercado de valor y más accesible a los discapacitados de bajos recursos. Y esa es mi ambición. Y el tiempo libre, somos un grupo de ciegos que junto a montañistas creamos, tengo entendido, el segundo club en el mundo de ciegos que hacemos trekking y vamos a la montaña 1 o 2 veces al mes. Gracias.
Thank you, that's fantastic. And maybe we could talk about your ambition at the end when we take questions. Could I hear maybe just one or two others? If there are any?
Hola, soy Boris. Mira, mi visión personal, que la vida le alcance, soy un hombre de 50 años, que la vida le alcance a disfrutar y a gozar de que el Estado chileno, de una vez por todas, se dé cuenta que las personas con discapacidad no solo necesitan, sino que tienen derecho a disfrutar y a gozar de lo mismo que gozan todos los chilenos. Ese es mi sueño, que mi vida me alcance a disfrutar de aquello. Estoy trabajando, soy parte de esta comisión y estoy trabajando con los niños que vienen detrás nuestros para que ellos disfruten de sus derechos. Y mi tiempo libre a un buen café, a un buen cigarrillo y acompañado de una buena mujer.
So I think that really illustrates extremely clearly how all of us have ambitions and have interests and pastimes that we like to explore, and that how so many of those are the same as everybody else in society. And just because we have a disability doesn't mean that we don't want to achieve the same kind of goals and ambitions and aspirations as everyone else in society. And for me, as a disabled person, that's one thing that I'm most passionate about, is that disabled people are seen as ordinary members of society, as citizens with passions and interests, and an important and valuable contribution to make as individuals in their own right. And that really forms the essence of the work that I do, that I've done in the past in my various careers, but also that I'm doing now, which I will talk about a little later. But it's really the vision and attitude that informed and led to the protests that we saw in London in 1994. So in London in 1994, disabled people took to the streets because, for the very reasons that we've just been hearing, that we have aspirations as well as needs. We've heard a lot about needs this morning, but I think the disability movement in the UK is much more about needs. It's much more about people having their basic needs met. It's about people having opportunities and being empowered to both fulfil those opportunities to participate and make a real contribution, and to be seen as contributors to the wealth, both the social wealth and the economic wealth of society. And these people are protesting about the lack of any legislation to really support them to do that. So in 1994, disabled people were taken to the streets. But how did we get from there to there, which is an image from the opening ceremony of the London 2012 Paralympics. So what I will be talking a little about is the journey that took us from the disabled people protesting to the most inclusive and accessible Olympic Games in history. So, in 1994, as I say, there were protests on the streets, and the protests that we saw then were because the government in place at the time, Conservative government, had voted against civil rights for disabled people. And this led to mass marches and demonstrations in the cities of the UK. Disabled people marching in the streets, chaining themselves to government buildings, chaining themselves to the London buses, which is an interesting sport, I think. Perhaps a little bit like water skiing, but anyway. And in response to that, the same government introduced its own legislation in 1995, the Disability Discrimination Act, which introduced anti-discrimination rights for disabled people not to be treated less favourably than non-disabled people, primarily in the realms of employment and access to goods and services. But unlike some of the examples we've heard this morning, that legislation wasn't accompanied by the establishment of a commission to oversee its implementation. And we had to wait another 2 years for change on that front. So in 1997, when the new Labour government came into power under Tony Blair, you may have heard of Tony Blair, he's a very famous international figure at the moment. His administration, one really good thing that Tony Blair did was commit to forming the Disability Rights Commission. And as well as that, his government recognised that in addition to anti-discrimination legislation, more work was needed to really identify how legislation and policy needed to change to deliver comprehensive civil rights for disabled people. And his government established the Disability Rights Task Force, which no, it's a text. That one. This is Justine, my friend, and this is why she's here to help me, so that I don't get lost in my slides. So the Disability Rights Task Force was comprised of a large number of disability organisations, politicians, the Minister for Disabled People, and the trade unions. And similarly to the report that we heard about in Ireland, made over 100 recommendations relating to an entire cross-section of government legislation and policy, and recommended how each government department should take on board the needs of disabled people to ensure that its range of policy responsibilities reflected the needs of the disabled population of the UK. The area I want to talk about specifically is that policy relating to the built environment and how that is planned, designed and constructed. And how I did this, let me backtrack a little. In the year 2000, the Disability Rights Commission was formed. In April 2000, and I joined the Commission in September 2000. And my responsibility was to implement the recommendations from the Disability Rights Task Force about the built environment. And I took the view that this very much in alignment with the philosophy of the disability movement in the UK that you've heard about, and the phrase I think you are all aware of, nothing about us without us. My position was that the implementation of the task force recommendations should be guided by disabled people, and disabled people in partnership with professionals and government officials. And I established the Disability Rights Commission Built Environment Advisory Forum, which met on a monthly basis to look at all of the policy relating to how we plan, design and manage buildings. And in our discussions, it became quite clear that we weren't all talking about the same philosophy. There were various terms being used, like universal design, design for all, barrier-free design, and inclusive design. And we felt that if we were to make any progress, we all had to be speaking the same language and sharing a common understanding of our definition of the principles and values that good design should include in order for our built environment to be inclusive and accessible. So in November 2001, we held a round table event to which 50 delegates were invited, and they represented a cross-section of disability organisations, disabled people, government officials and building professionals, so architects, planners, building managers, construction specialists, surveyors, lots of people from the building and contracting community. And the focus of that really was to facilitate dialogue, conversation between all of those interested in how we plan, design and manage the built environment, but with the emphasis on achieving an outcome that would ensure that we would move forward with a philosophy that would create places and spaces that would work for everybody, but particularly with disabled people in mind, so that they would no longer be excluded, because the focus would be on inclusion and not just access. So access as a term implies that you can enter a building, but can you use it? Can you participate in the fullest range of activities that building or space might host? I'm not sure. But the term inclusion certainly suggests that should be the expectation. And in November 2001, we published Creating an Inclusive Environment. And this document really identified both the definition and the principles necessary to achieve the best possible outcomes for inclusion in the way that we build our environment. And one of the fundamental points was that it recognised that if we're going to achieve truly accessible and inclusive places and spaces, then we have to start at the beginning of the process. It's no good building your building and then deciding how you're going to make it accessible and inclusive. You have to start on the plans, with the drawings on the drawing board. And in the UK, we have two pieces of legislation that govern how we plan and build buildings. We have planning law, which decides where you can build a building, which way it faces, so where the doors might be in relation to the street, what it looks like, its size, what colour it is, what it's made from, and then we have what it's used for, and then we have the Building Act, which says how it should be designed and how it should be built. So there's two pieces of legislation. And the document Creating an Inclusive Environment recognised that both pieces of legislation needed to be changed so that they work together. so that the decisions that affect how a building can be accessed and used are taken at the right stage in the development process and the planning of that building to ensure that it is as easy to use as we want it to be. And as well as setting that out, it identified that inclusive design is fundamentally rooted in the social model of disability. And the social model of disability, as it's evolved from the disability movement in the UK, says that this disabled people, and the term, I use the term disabled people deliberately because it really flows from the social model that says a disability is something that's imposed on an individual by a society's lack of capacity to respond to their needs. So people can be empowered to fulfil their aspirations if we change the way we plan and build our environment, for example, how we organise work, how we organise education. These are the barriers that create opportunities, that prevent or create opportunities. So the social model really puts the emphasis on society and its institutions to empower disabled people to fulfil their potential. And it differs from the previous models that had really informed the culture in the UK towards disabled people, which were a medical model which talks about cure, adaptation, treatment to change people, and the charity model which really is largely informed by the need to generate finance for charities to support the work that they do to support disabled people, but not necessarily about the best interest of disabled people and not necessarily about empowering disabled people to take responsibility for themselves and to lead independent lives. So the social model is primarily the one that has informed the philosophy of inclusive design in the UK. We also principles. The inclusive design document set out some key principles that should inform how every building or environment or space should be conceptualised, planned, designed and managed. And I'd like to invite, please, our interpreter to read that from the screen because it might be easier for him to do that than for me. He's doing that. So it's an environment that is really one that enables its users, disabled people particularly, to choose how they use it and use it on their terms. So not to be constrained by the way that the building is designed and managed, and to be able to participate in all of the activities it hosts. And it also recognises that we are all different, and yet that it acknowledges, embraces that, so it meets those the requirements of our differences, and it enables us to act with confidence. It's obviously safe, but it also conveys a sense of safety to us as well. So it means that it may be safe technically, but it also means that we feel safe when we're in the space. So for many of us, perhaps some of us with visual impairment particularly, there are some environments that maybe don't look safe because of the way that they've been finished or the way that they're lit, for example. They don't necessarily convey a strong sense of comfort or security. It's also legible and predictable, which means that it makes sense when you're trying to move around and through the space. It follows a logical plan. and there aren't any nasty tricks or surprises around the corner. And the last point is that it should be of high quality. So just because it's been designed to be accessible and inclusive doesn't mean it should be treated less seriously by the designers or the owners or the building managers. It's of equal priority. And so we published that document in November 2001, and just to show you what happened to those principles, this is the Greater London Authority version of the document, which is the one they still use today. So these principles are still the one that are used across London now. Very similar principles and the philosophy. But as I say, what was really important was how the planning law and the building legislation work together. And one of the key recommendations that emerged from our first roundtable on inclusive design was that we needed to look at a mechanism and identify a mechanism to tie much more closely together the way that the planning law works and the building law. In the UK, we have a planning system which is overseen by planning officers in local councils, in regions and in local government. And they make one set of decisions about a building or a development. And then next to them, we have building control inspectors who make another set of decisions about whether a building has been designed and constructed in accordance with their regulations. And it's not always the case that those two talk to each other. And it may be the case that a building owner could be trying to achieve the best outcome possible in their design, but because a bad decision has been taken at the planning stage, that they're prevented from doing so. So our second roundtable in 2003 was looking at, as I say, the mechanisms that we could introduce to really integrate better the planning and building systems. And what we came up with was something called the access statement. We published this guidance in 2003, I think, which sets out how the access statement should be used and what it should look like at the different stages of the development process. So how it should be written for planning at the planning stage, and how it should identify those issues that should be considered at the planning stage, and then how those later inform the more detailed way in which the building is designed and managed. So it's a continuous record of the evolution of a building, from paper right the way through to construction, to management, and in its purest form, right through to demolition, and looks at all of the issues around accessibility within that process. So the guidance, as I say, achieving continuity through the development process through access statements, was published, and from a round table comprising 50 or more delegates, disabled people's organisations, government, building professionals, same audience as with the Inclusive Design Roundtable. But what was particularly powerful about that was because we had the government officials in the room, the conversations began about how we needed to change planning law and the building legislation to ensure that access statements could play a part in informing how the built environment is developed. and those were encouraging conversations, but it still took a lot of work, and it required myself and to work with many disability organisations and building organisations to lobby government to introduce the change in legislation needed. But in 2004, we were successful. So, in 2004, the government passed the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act. And within that, we were successful in having a new regulation introduced that required all planning applications in the UK to be accompanied by an access statement, which meant that whatever size the project was, the building owner and the developer and the design and the architects, whoever was involved in the project, had to produce an access statement and to submit it with their documentation seeking approval for the development with their local authority, with their planning authority, which for the first time meant that accessibility and inclusive design was being considered fully at the planning stage, so much nearer the beginning of the process where it needed to be. But in addition to that, we achieved changes to the building regulations, which in the same year, 2004, recommends that access statements should be submitted with the plans seeking approval for from building control to better inform the building approval process. And this really has informed the way since 2004 that planning and building regulations have addressed accessibility. The access statement itself has been an incredibly useful and effective way of ensuring that new buildings in the UK are inclusive and accessible from much earlier on in the process and achieve better results for disabled people in their use. I think the most effective and powerful demonstration of this, and I hope that many of you will have seen examples of this, was with the London Paralympic Games. The London Paralympic Games set out an inclusive design strategy, as part of which required access statements from the earliest stage in the design and development of all of the buildings and spaces that were going to form the Olympic Park in East London. And this is a plan showing the Olympic Park in London. And for all of the buildings and areas that you see, an access statement would have had to have been provided to the planning authority. So, this is a list of all of the areas within the Olympic Park and buildings that an access statement would need to be provided for. I hope our translator can read down that list for you. I'll do it in English. But so those include the site topography, so ensuring that the park itself had shallow enough gradients and for people to circulate around using whatever mobility support that you needed, whether you were a wheelchair user, whether you walk with sticks, that sort of thing. So ensuring that the layout of the site was managed, and the levels, if any levels were changed, then they continued to be inclusive. So any parking provision provided good access for people near to the venues to which they wanted to experience the events that they were attending. So all of the concourse areas, the public areas where people would meet and gather, all of the walkways and the seating. So the seating was designed to provide a range of options. So it's different kinds of seating in different areas. So again, depending on your particular impairment, there will be seats there that would be comfortable for you. All of the entrances to be wide enough and level enough. So all of the internal circulation to be spacious enough so that you could circulate and get to the areas within the buildings that you needed to access for your seating or for the concessions or to whatever. So all of the spectator services, all of the signage and wayfinding needs to be inclusive. So that included very clear signboards, but it also included electronic audible navigation systems as well. The lighting, spectator seating, especially sanitary provision, toilet facilities were all designed to be unisex accessible, but adult changing areas as well, so that for adults that needed changing benches to lay on, so if they had to change for any reason, then much more spacious provision was provided for those. And lastly, and perhaps more importantly than any, the emergency egress, so ensuring that in an emergency the routes out of the Olympic Park and venues were as accessible as the routes in. So if there was a fire or any other kind of emergency, that the ways out were just as inclusive as the ways in, but perhaps more so because you're needing to travel more quickly. So, and just to illustrate one example of that, we have this is a family and baby changing area, and this is the diagram supporting the access statement for that area. So it'll give you a little idea of the information, the detail of the information that was provided to accompany the access statement for this particular feature. But you can imagine that for something the size of the Olympic Park, how many access statements were drafted and submitted throughout the development of that project. Hundreds. But it was process such as these, tools such as the access statement, that really enabled us to create the event that the London Paralympics became. And as I say, those processes were built on consensus. They were a product of facilitating meaningful but open dialogue between the government, the professionals, the architects, the planners, the surveyors, and disability organisations and individuals who are the real experts in creating environments that enable them to fulfil their potential. So, this is what we achieved. Can you click? Yes, can you click it on? So this, to give you a flavour and a reminder, perhaps if you would like. Just click this one. I hope our translator is also describing the images for those of us that can't see them, and I'm included in that. So, those of you in the audience that would like him to translate, could you tell me if he is? Okay. So that was a beautiful moment in history, and I think a shining example of what can be achieved through inclusive dialogue and bringing together expert users from the disability community, professionals and policymakers. But I think what's becoming clear in the UK, as we've heard from some of the other speakers this morning, one of the fundamental barriers that we still face is attitude. And we can introduce the most far-reaching and progressive changes to legislation, regulation and policy, but unless we have a change of attitude, we can't guarantee that those changes will be sustained. And already in the UK, we are seeing the reduction and revocation of some of the planning and building laws that we successfully changed in the mid-2000s. So this really indicates to me why we need to work at the attitudinal level. If we want to achieve sustaining and long-lasting change, then we have to work with everybody to change their attitudes about disability. We have to achieve a culture change in all of our societies that enables the wide population to see that disabled people not only have needs and not only need welfare, but actually offer society a valuable resource of skills, expertise and perspective. And I just want to close with some of the work that I'm doing now, which I'm not sure if this is going to work, but it... It's not going to work. I have to go to the website. Okay. Is that... Here we go. Yeah. I had some video to show you, but YouTube has let me down. But the video is an example of the work that I'm doing in the UK at the attitudinal level, and it's demonstrating about really how everyone has something to learn from each other. And we've designed some workshops that are led by visually impaired people, and the workshops work in two ways. We have workshops that take people outside, called Super Sense, and this is what's on the screen at the moment, or not. BBC. Super Sense takes people outdoors. It's led by visually impaired facilitators, and we blindfold our participants and work with them to achieve outdoor activities ranging from exploring woodland through to surfing, kayaking and climbing, but they do all this blindfold, but facilitated by blind and visually impaired facilitators. And it's using the visually impaired facilitators' skills, the sensory skills, to enable sighted participants to relearn how to use their full sensory abilities. And we do that by taking them into challenging and sometimes quite extreme outdoor scenarios and supporting them to explore the power of their non-visual senses. And this model works in two ways. One is that it conveys a very powerful message that visually impaired people, by virtue of their experience, have a lot to teach society, and also that non-visually impaired people have a lot to learn about themselves and their own sensory abilities. And the other experience that we run is called Supper Sense, and is similar, but works with food and explores people's experience to enjoy their food without being able to see, but enjoying their capacity to taste, to smell, and some other sensory interactive experiences as well, that as blind people we have to rely on more frequently, and that sighted people forget they have. And these two are led by blind and visually impaired facilitators. But the overarching philosophy for me, I think, is summed up most beautifully and I'd be grateful if the translator could translate that for you, please. Oh. Thank you. And I welcome any questions you may have. Can you tell me when this, because I think that's super
el tema del diseño y de accesibilidad universal se vuelve absolutamente relevante para la inclusión social de las personas en situación de discapacidad. Quiero felicitar tu exposición por la larga lucha que has obtenido en tu país y los logros que han obtenido, porque en muchos países a veces hay luchas y no se logran estas cosas. Tenemos súper claro que por lo menos en Chile, para lograr la plena inclusión de las personas con discapacidad es necesario el diseño y la accesibilidad universal para que las personas puedan salir de sus casas y llegar a los lugares de salud, los lugares de educación, los lugares de trabajo. Si no, realmente se vuelve esta tarea imposible. Tenemos súper claro que en nuestro país, en la región, la realidad es más cruda aún que en Santiago, que los que vivimos en Santiago. Realmente felicitarte, espero que en Chile podamos ver estos frutos personas puedan llegar sin ninguna dificultad, que los edificios, que acá en Chile se toma el ejemplo de construir edificios con accesibilidad universal y no después tratar de ir mejorando después de que están construidos. ¿Por qué? Porque creo que todas las personas con discapacidad tenemos todo el derecho de querer salir de nuestro departamento e ir a visitar a un amigo o amiga, y muchas veces no se puede lograr porque la silla no entra por la puerta o porque no tiene un baño accesible para las personas con discapacidad física o algún problema de movilidad. Creo que la accesibilidad universal, como estamos viendo dentro de la comisión también, es una prioridad para todas las discapacidades. Y me refiero con esto, la accesibilidad universal, también a las comunicaciones, a la información, a la difusión, a todo lo que tenga que ver a estar en igualdad, al igual que las personas que no tienen ninguna discapacidad. Nuevamente felicitarte, Andy, y muy feliz de que estés acá presente y veamos estos resultados y que las cosas se puedan lograr tras una gran lucha. Creo también que mientras no se incorpore en las mallas curriculares el tema de discapacidad, que es transversal, no estoy refiriéndome solamente a la carrera de arquitectura, sino que absolutamente a todas, y no solo a las personas que estudian pedagogía, este tema va a ser más incorporado en cada uno y vamos a hacer algo no tan extraño para las demás personas. Creo que es necesario este cambio radical y la unión, como tú bien lo dijiste, de las habilidades que tenemos las personas en situación de discapacidad, más un trabajo con los legisladores, más un trabajo con los expertos, ya realmente llegar a estos resultados, como tú bien dijiste, nosotros, las personas con discapacidad o en situación de discapacidad, somos los expertos, pero 24/7, porque vivimos día a día lo que es la discapacidad.
Yes.
Gracias, Andy.
Hola, Poli de nuevo. Mira, a través de unos compañeros hemos discutido y conversado sobre el modelo social de la discapacidad que se implantó en Inglaterra. Eso como comentario, y yo creo que hemos asistido, y me voy a dirigir a las personas con discapacidad que hay aquí hoy, chilenas.
Yes.
Hemos asistido a una clase, y no quiero caer en la exageración, pero creo que hemos asistido a una clase magistral de cómo se deben hacer las cosas por parte de los discapacitados. Andy nos ha mostrado que si nosotros no nos este es un término chileno, no sé si se lo podrán traducir a pero si no nos paramos en el macho, esto no va a cambiar. Los cambios van a ver, una atención, yo entiendo que hay una catástrofe en Chile hoy, pero hoy aquí ninguna autoridad, ninguna. Entonces, démonos cuenta, muchachos, amigos discapacitados, que si nosotros no nos organizamos y no nos paramos en el espacio proletar, no vamos a lograr nada. Antes una pregunta. En Chile, el gobierno está proponiendo crear una subsecretaría de la discapacidad. Hay algunos que postulamos que la variable de discapacidad debe estar en cada ministerio, en cada departamento gubernamental, no sé cómo lo llaman allá. Pero acá en Chile se llama ministerio, en cada ministerio debería estar presente la variable de discapacidad. Y acá, obviamente, a juicio de algunos, incluyo, ese alguien debería ser una persona con discapacidad. Ese alguien que está a cargo de ese departamento. Allá, ¿cómo lo hicieron? ¿Y qué opinan de crear una institucionalidad nueva vez de abordarlo desde cada ministerio, de cada departamento. Gracias.
Thank you, Boris. So, in the UK, the task force report that I spoke about at the beginning, I did identify. In the UK, we have ministries, but we have less ministries than we used to. We have more departments now than ministries. But it did identify that many aspects of disability equality could only be achieved with relevant department taking responsibility for its own area of policy. And within the Commission, the Disability Rights Commission, we had specialist policy workers, especially policy managers in my case, to work with each department. So would meet with the government officials and advise them on what needed to change. And we were informed by our experts, like in my case, the Built Environment Advisory Forum, so that informed the conversations that I had with the government officials in the Department for Environment, who are responsible for building legislation and planning legislation. But I had colleagues working with education, in the health service, and in employment with our Department for Employment at the time. So, as well as having our overall commission with responsibility for implementing and embedding disability equality in the UK, at a high level, we had, as I say, policy specialists working across the range of government departments responsible for the specific policy areas. I hope that answers your question.
Sí, miembro de la comisión. Mi pregunta es, ¿esta nueva normativa de construcción se aplica a los nuevos departamentos, a todos? Quiero decir, como realidad, no si existe o no existe, la normativa existe, pero quisiera saber la aplicabilidad, o también se está aplicando hacia los edificios antiguos, porque específicamente Londres tiene mucha edificación antigua.
So, how the law works, this is also about the relationship between the disability law, it's now the Equality Act, but it changed in 2010, but it used to be the Disability Discrimination Act. And that requires that all service providers need to make adjustments to the way that they provide their service, including adapting their buildings to make them accessible for disabled people and indeed everybody covered by equality legislation, so that they can access the services and the goods available in those premises on equal terms. So that's the first piece of legislation. And the relationship then exists with the building regulations in terms of, and the planning law, in terms of when they make those alterations, they have to comply with building law and planning law. So those three pieces of legislation work together. They should work together. And it relates to new buildings, it relates to existing buildings, and it relates equally to historic buildings. People who own historic buildings sometimes try and say they're special, but we need to dissuade them that even though they have a special building, disabled people have the right to enjoy that building along with everybody else. And it may be that the alterations they make are slightly different to those that you would expect in a new building, but they have to achieve the best that they can within the challenges and the constraints of the historic structure from which they're offering their service. Thank you. I hope that was helpful.
Bueno, muchas gracias.